Let's start with something that most people completely misunderstand. When an avoidant woman wants to know whether you've really moved on, she usually doesn't need to ask you directly. She doesn't have to say, "Do you still love me?" She can learn almost everything she needs to know from what happens when she creates a small opening. Maybe it's a simple, "Hey, how have you been?" Maybe she reacts to something you post. Maybe she asks a question that doesn't really need to be asked. Maybe she suddenly remembers something from the past and uses it as a reason to contact you. On the surface, it can look meaningless. But psychologically, your response can reveal something much deeper, because there is a difference between moving on intellectually and moving on emotionally. You can tell yourself, "I'm done with her, I don't care anymore." But if one unexpected message immediately changes your mood, raises your heartbeat, fills your mind with possibilities, and makes you start imagining a reunion, then the emotional attachment may still be active. And that is what makes this so important. The test isn't necessarily whether she contacts you. The test is what happens inside you when she does. If she sends one message and suddenly you're analyzing every word, wondering why she reached out, checking when she was last online, rewriting your response 10 times, or trying to figure out whether this means she wants you back, then she has learned something. She has learned that the emotional door may still be open. Now, this doesn't mean every avoidant woman consciously designs some elaborate psychological test. Human beings are far more complicated than that. Sometimes people reach out because they are curious. Sometimes because they miss the familiarity. Sometimes because they genuinely want reconnection. Sometimes because they are lonely. The important thing is not guessing her exact motive. The important thing is understanding your own reaction. Because the moment you become obsessed with decoding her behavior, you hand your emotional authority back to her. Think about that. You spent weeks or months trying to regain your peace. You worked on yourself. You rebuilt your routine. You started focusing on your goals. You stopped checking for signs. And then one tiny message appears, and suddenly your entire emotional world revolves around what she might mean. That is not freedom. Freedom is when her message becomes information rather than an emotional command. You can read it without immediately creating a story around it. You can respond without abandoning your standards. You can choose not to respond if responding would pull you back into confusion. And most importantly, you don't need to prove anything. This is where real personal power begins. Because when someone knows they still have emotional control over you, they don't necessarily need to offer commitment. They don't need to provide clarity. They can simply create a little opening, and you rush toward it. But when you have genuinely moved forward, something changes. You don't become cruel. You don't become arrogant. You don't pretend you never cared. You simply stop chasing emotional breadcrumbs. If she reaches out, you observe. You don't assume. If she shows interest, you look for consistency. You don't build a future from one conversation. If she becomes warm, you don't immediately forget why things became painful in the first place. You let actions accumulate before you assign meaning. That is emotional maturity. And this is going to matter even more as we move forward, because the next question is not whether she can get your attention. The next question is whether she can recognize that your entire energy has changed. Because when you have truly moved on, you don't need to announce it. People feel it. Your silence feels different. Your responses feel different. Your availability feels different. Your priorities feel different. And suddenly, the person who once assumed you would always be emotionally available begins to encounter something unfamiliar, a version of you who can care without chasing. That is the real shift. You don't prove you've moved on by making her jealous. You don't prove it by ignoring her. You prove it by becoming so grounded in your own life that her behavior no longer dictates your emotional state. The ultimate test isn't whether she comes back, it's whether you still lose yourself when she does. And this is where things get even more interesting, because once you stop reacting to the small openings she creates, she may begin paying attention to something much more subtle: your energy. Not your words, not your announcements, your energy. You see, people can say almost anything. You can tell someone, "I'm completely over you," while secretly checking their profile every night. You can post motivational quotes about self-respect while hoping they see them. You can tell your friends you don't care while spending hours wondering why they haven't contacted you. But emotional transformation doesn't need an announcement. It becomes visible through behavior. When you have genuinely moved forward, you become less reactive. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop trying to make someone understand what they lost. You stop creating situations designed to provoke a response. And an avoidant woman may notice that change precisely because it is so different from what she remembers. Maybe before, she could disappear and you would reach out. Maybe she could become distant and you would ask what was wrong. Maybe she could give you mixed signals and you would work harder to restore the connection. But now, you don't chase the silence. You don't fight for attention. You don't make your life revolve around whether she is emotionally available today. And that difference can be powerful because human beings notice patterns. When someone has been accustomed to receiving a particular response from you and suddenly that response disappears, the mind naturally becomes curious. What changed? Why isn't he reacting the way he used to? Is he really moving on? Does he still care? Notice something important here. You don't need to manufacture that curiosity. You don't need to become cold. You don't need to manipulate her. You don't need to post pictures designed to make her jealous. In fact, the more you try to create an effect, the more you reveal that you're still emotionally invested in getting one. Real detachment is quieter. It looks like going to work and focusing on your purpose. It looks like spending time with people who energize you. It looks like improving your health, your career, your confidence, your friendships, and your relationship with yourself. It looks like waking up in the morning and realizing that the first question in your mind is no longer, what is she doing? That is the transformation. Because moving on isn't about deleting someone from your memory. It's about removing them from the center of your emotional decision-making. And there is a philosophical principle underneath this that most people miss. Whatever controls your attention eventually influences your identity. If your attention is constantly captured by another person's behavior, then they possess a form of psychological power over you. But when you reclaim your attention, you reclaim your agency. That's why your energy changes when you truly heal. You aren't trying to demonstrate independence. You simply become independent. You aren't trying to look unavailable. You become selective about what deserves your availability. You aren't trying to make her regret losing you. You become so committed to your own growth that whether she regrets it or not becomes secondary. And ironically, that is often when your absence becomes more noticeable. Not because you're playing a game, because you're no longer participating in the old game. If she reaches out, you don't immediately interpret it as destiny. If she watches your stories, you don't turn it into a relationship forecast. If she suddenly becomes warmer, you don't abandon your standards. You observe. You remain grounded. You let reality reveal itself through consistent behavior. And that's the difference between emotional reaction and emotional power. The old version of you may have needed reassurance from her. The new version of you gives reassurance to yourself. So if you're wondering whether she can tell you've really moved on, stop worrying about what you can make her see. Look at yourself. Are you calmer? Are you more focused? Are you less reactive? Are you building a life that doesn't require her participation to feel meaningful? Because when the answer becomes yes, you don't have to tell her you've changed. Your peace becomes the message, and your changed energy becomes the proof. And once she notices that your energy has changed, another dynamic can emerge. She may pull back again. This is where many people lose the progress they've made. Because imagine you finally become calm. You've stopped chasing. You've stopped trying to convince her to choose you. You're rebuilding your life, and then suddenly she gives you a little attention. Maybe she sends a message. Maybe she becomes warm. Maybe she appears interested, and you respond naturally. And then silence. Nothing. No explanation, no clarity, just distance again. What happens next? If you immediately start chasing, you've just revealed that the emotional pattern hasn't actually changed. This isn't about labeling every withdrawal as some deliberate manipulation. People withdraw for many reasons, and avoidant attachment can involve genuine discomfort with emotional closeness. But regardless of the reason, the effect on you can be the same. Uncertainty activates your old desire to restore connection. And that's the psychological trap. You begin thinking, what happened? Did I say something wrong? Why did she suddenly change? Maybe I should send another message. So, maybe she needs reassurance. And before you know it, you're back in the old role, trying to manage someone else's distance. But here's the question you need to ask yourself. Why should someone else's withdrawal automatically become your emergency? That's a profound shift. When you're emotionally dependent on someone's response, their silence feels like a threat. You experience distance as something you must immediately fix. But when you've genuinely moved on, distance becomes information. That's all. She stepped back. You notice it. You don't panic. You don't chase. You don't punish. You don't create some dramatic counterreaction. You simply continue living. And that response can reveal more about your emotional transformation than any speech about self-respect ever could. Because moving on isn't proven when everything is going well. It's proven when the old trigger appears and you respond differently. That's where growth becomes real. Anyone can feel powerful when someone is giving them attention. The real test is what happens when the attention disappears. Do you collapse? Do you obsess? Do you start bargaining? Or can you remain centered? This is where emotional maturity becomes a form of freedom. You stop asking, how do I get her to come closer? And you start asking, is this dynamic actually healthy for me? That's a completely different question. The first question puts your power outside yourself. The second brings it home. And understand something else. If she is accustomed to you chasing whenever she withdraws, your refusal to participate changes the entire pattern. Suddenly, she can't rely on the old predictable sequence. Distance no longer produces pursuit. Silence no longer produces paragraphs. Withdrawal no longer produces emotional negotiations. And that doesn't mean you're trying to make her anxious. It means you're no longer willing to abandon yourself simply because another person becomes uncertain. That's an important distinction. Your goal isn't to punish her for needing space. Your goal is to respect yourself enough to stop confusing space with an invitation to chase. If she needs time, give her time. If she wants connection, let her communicate that clearly. If she wants to rebuild something, look for consistent action. You don't have to solve the ambiguity for her. And this is where the philosophical lesson becomes powerful. You cannot create security by constantly pursuing someone who is creating uncertainty. At some point, you must stop trying to control the other person's emotional state and start controlling your own response. That is where your strength returns. So she pulls back again. Don't immediately interpret it as rejection. And don't immediately interpret it as a secret test either. Observe, stay grounded, keep moving forward. Because if you've truly moved on, her retreat doesn't send you backward. You can care about someone and still refuse to chase them. You can understand someone's fears and still maintain boundaries. You can leave the door unlocked emotionally without standing at the door waiting. And that's the difference between attachment and self-abandonment. When her distance no longer makes you chase, you haven't lost her. You finally found yourself. And once she realizes that you are no longer chasing every withdrawal, another form of curiosity can appear. She may begin wondering whether someone else has your attention. Now, don't misunderstand this. Not every question about your social life means jealousy, and not every curious comment means she wants a relationship again. Human behavior is rarely that simple. But when someone has been emotionally significant to you, discovering that your attention may be moving elsewhere can create a very different psychological response, because attention has value. When someone believes they still occupy a central position in your emotional world, they can feel secure in that knowledge, even if they aren't actively choosing a relationship with you. But when that certainty disappears, curiosity can take its place. Maybe she casually asks, "Are you seeing anyone?" Or maybe she notices that you're going out more. Maybe she hears through mutual friends that you're meeting new people. Maybe she starts paying closer attention to what you're doing. Or perhaps she makes a seemingly innocent comment about whether you found someone new. The important thing is not to immediately label this as jealousy. The important thing is to understand what it can reveal about changing emotional dynamics. For a long time, she may have known where she stood with you. She may have assumed that even if she stepped away, you would remain emotionally available. But now imagine that assumption disappears. Suddenly, the person who once waited for her is living. He's building. He's meeting people. He's developing new interests. He's becoming less emotionally dependent on whether she returns. And that can create a psychological contrast. The contrast between who you were when she had easy access to your attention and who you are now that your attention has become valuable to you. But here's where you must be extremely careful. Do not turn your healing into a performance designed to make her jealous. Don't manufacture photographs with another woman. Don't suddenly become obsessed with displaying how desirable you are. Don't post things hoping she'll notice. Because the moment you start doing those things for her reaction, she is still controlling your behavior. You're simply chasing her through a different strategy. Real movement forward is much quieter. You don't need her to know you're dating. You don't need her to regret losing you. You don't need her to wonder who replaced her. Your life genuinely becomes bigger than the relationship. And ironically, that is what makes the change more noticeable. Think about the psychology of attention. What we repeatedly focus on becomes emotionally significant. If you once gave her enormous amounts of attention, and now that attention is distributed across your goals, friendships, health, career, creativity, and future, the difference can be felt. You haven't necessarily become less caring, you've become less consumed. And that's a profound distinction. Being emotionally mature doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It means you stop confusing love with fixation. You can remember someone without waiting for them. You can appreciate what you shared without needing to recreate it. You can meet someone new without using them as a weapon against someone from your past. And you can allow your life to continue without constantly checking whether the person you left behind has noticed. That's where genuine freedom begins. If she asks about your life, answer honestly. If she expresses curiosity, don't exploit it. If she becomes interested again, don't immediately assume the relationship is restored. Let her actions tell you what her words mean. Because curiosity isn't commitment. Jealousy isn't emotional availability. Missing you isn't the same as being prepared to build something healthy with you. And this is one of the most important lessons you can take from the entire conversation. You don't measure someone's intentions by how strongly they react to losing access to you. You measure them by what they are willing to consistently contribute when they have access to you again. That's the standard. So if she becomes curious about whether someone else has your attention, don't make your next move about proving your value. Let your life speak for you. Keep building, keep growing, keep becoming the person you respect. Because the greatest sign that you've moved on isn't that another woman has replaced her. It's that you no longer need anyone to replace her. Your life becomes the answer when you stop living for someone else's reaction. And this brings us to something even deeper, because after an avoidant woman notices that your attention has changed, she may begin discovering whether the old version of you is still available. This is where your transformation gets tested, because people don't only remember what you said, they remember what they could consistently get from you. Maybe she remembers how quickly you responded whenever she reached out. Maybe she remembers how easily you forgave. Maybe she remembers that whenever she became distant, you became more available. Whenever she needed reassurance, you provided it. Whenever she became uncertain, you tried harder. And there is nothing inherently wrong with being caring. The problem begins when your kindness becomes predictable self-abandonment. When someone knows that they can disappear and you'll chase, withdraw, and you'll reassure, become inconsistent and you'll compensate, the relationship develops a pattern. And patterns are powerful. That's why genuine moving on isn't simply about feeling less emotion. It's about changing the pattern. She may return expecting the same version of you, the version who immediately opens the door, the version who says, "Don't worry, I understand." The version who accepts ambiguity because having some connection feels better than having none. But what happens when she encounters someone different? You can still be respectful. You can still be compassionate. You can still listen. But you no longer negotiate against your own standards. That's a completely different form of strength. And here's something important. Boundaries are not punishments. If she reaches out, you don't have to become cold just to prove that you've moved on. You don't have to ignore her deliberately. You don't have to make her feel what you once felt. That's still emotional attachment, just expressed through resistance instead of pursuit. Real detachment sounds more like this. I hear you. I understand. I'm open to a conversation, but I need consistency. I'm not interested in repeating the same cycle. Notice the difference. You're not demanding that she become someone else. You're simply refusing to become someone you don't respect just to keep her. That is what self-respect actually looks like. And this is where the psychological shift becomes profound. When you stop rewarding inconsistency with unlimited access, you change the meaning of your presence. Your attention becomes intentional. Your availability becomes earned through mutual effort. Your affection becomes connected to reciprocity rather than anxiety. And suddenly, she has to encounter reality rather than the fantasy that you will always be waiting. But remember, this isn't about creating scarcity as a manipulation tactic. You are not trying to make yourself difficult to get. You're becoming difficult to misuse. That's a major difference. You don't need to become emotionally unavailable simply because someone else is. You don't need to play games. You don't need to pretend you don't care. You simply become unwilling to participate in a dynamic that repeatedly costs you your peace. And that is exactly why moving on can be so powerful. Because when you genuinely move forward, your standards rise with you. You begin asking different questions. Not, does she still want me? But can we actually build something healthy? Not, how do I get her attention? But, does this connection deserve my attention? Not, what can I do to make her stay? But, is this relationship consistent with the person I'm becoming? Those questions transform everything, because the old version of you may have measured success by whether she chose you. The new version measures success by whether you choose yourself while remaining open to something mutually healthy. And if she comes back, that's when you become especially observant. Don't be hypnotized by words. Watch patterns, watch consistency. Watch whether her behavior matches what she says. Watch whether she can communicate when things become uncomfortable. Watch whether closeness is followed by another unexplained disappearance. Because one emotional conversation cannot erase an established pattern. Change requires repetition. Trust requires evidence. And commitment requires participation from both people. So if she returns looking for the old version of you, don't become that person again simply because you missed the connection. Let her meet who you are now. Not the person who chased, not the person who waited, not the person who accepted crumbs because he was afraid of losing the entire relationship. Let her meet the person who can care deeply without abandoning himself. The strongest proof that you've moved on is not that you stopped loving, it's that you stopped betraying yourself to be loved. And now we arrive at the deepest test of all. Because after all the messages, the distance, the curiosity, the changes in your energy, and the attempts to discover whether the old version of you is still available, there comes a moment when the question is no longer whether she wants access to you. The question is whether you still need her to choose you. That is the final test. Think about how different that is. When you're emotionally attached to an outcome, her return feels like validation. You start thinking, if she comes back, then I mattered. If she regrets losing me, then I was valuable. If she finally chooses me, then everything I went through is worth it. But that's a dangerous place to live because you've placed your worth in someone else's decision. And the moment another person becomes responsible for confirming your value, you surrender your power. Real moving on changes the question completely. Instead of asking, does she want me back? You begin asking, do I still want this relationship as it actually was? Not as you imagined it could become, not as it was during the best moments, not based on potential, as it actually was. Was there consistency? Was there emotional safety? Was communication possible? Could both people express their needs without punishment, withdrawal, or fear? Could conflict be handled maturely? Could intimacy exist without one person constantly chasing while the other constantly retreated? These are the questions that matter, because someone returning does not automatically mean the relationship has changed. Sometimes people return because they miss familiarity. Sometimes because they feel lonely. Sometimes because they finally notice the absence of your attention. Sometimes because they genuinely recognize what they lost and are prepared to do something different. And you don't have to decide which one it is based on emotion alone. You can observe. That's maturity. You don't slam the door simply to prove strength, but you don't throw the door open simply because someone knocked. You pause. You evaluate. You allow behavior to speak. This is where your transformation becomes undeniable. Imagine she comes back tomorrow. The old version of you might immediately feel relief. The new version of you feels curiosity. What has changed? What are you looking for? What are you willing to build? Are your actions going to be different this time? That's emotional freedom. You can hear her without losing yourself. You can care without surrendering your standards. You can be open without becoming desperate. And perhaps most importantly, you can say no without needing her to understand why. That is what self-respect looks like. Because moving on was never supposed to mean becoming incapable of love. It means becoming capable of love without abandoning yourself. You can still have compassion for her fears. You can understand avoidant tendencies. You can recognize that someone may struggle with intimacy without making their struggle your responsibility. Understanding someone does not obligate you to tolerate everything they do. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-neglect. Boundaries without compassion can become bitterness. But when you combine compassion with self-respect, you develop something much more powerful, emotional sovereignty. You no longer need to control what she feels. You no longer need to predict what she will do. You no longer need to monitor whether she regrets losing you. You simply control what you will participate in. And that is the ultimate shift. The relationship no longer determines your identity. Her silence doesn't define your worth. Her return doesn't validate your worth. Her rejection doesn't destroy your worth. You already decided who you are. So if she comes back, you don't ask, how do I make this work at any cost? You ask, does this work for both of us? See? If the answer is yes, you build slowly, consciously, and through consistent action. If the answer is no, you walk away without needing revenge, drama, or another explanation, because you finally understand something that changes everything. Being chosen by someone is beautiful, but choosing yourself is foundational. And when you reach that point, whether she comes back or not, you have already won the most important battle. You haven't truly moved on when you stop loving her. You've moved on when her choice no longer determines yours. So let's bring everything together. If an avoidant woman wants to know whether you've really moved on, she doesn't necessarily need you to tell her. She watches. She notices whether a small message can still pull you back. She notices whether your energy has changed. She notices whether her withdrawal still makes you chase. She becomes curious about whether someone else now has your attention. And she may test whether the old version of you, the version who was always available, always explaining, always waiting, is still standing where she left him. But understand this, your goal was never to pass her test. Your goal was to outgrow the need to take it. That's the deeper lesson. Because if you're constantly wondering, is she checking on me? Does she miss me? Is she jealous? Will she come back? Then you're still organizing your emotional life around her. You've changed the question, but you haven't changed the attachment. Real freedom comes when the focus returns to you. What are you building? Who are you becoming? What kind of relationship will you accept now? What standards are no longer negotiable? What kind of peace are you unwilling to sacrifice again? Those are the questions that matter. And if she comes back, don't rush to reward the return with immediate access. Don't punish her either. Simply observe. Let actions accumulate. Let consistency speak. Let time reveal whether something genuinely changed. Because missing you isn't the same as being ready for you. Curiosity isn't commitment. Jealousy isn't emotional availability. And one emotional conversation doesn't erase an entire pattern. If she truly wants to rebuild something, she will have to participate in rebuilding it, and you don't have to chase her into that process. You don't have to convince her. You don't have to prove your value. You don't have to become colder. You simply have to remain grounded in the person you've become. That's what moving on really means. It doesn't mean you suddenly forget everything. It doesn't mean you never think about her again. It doesn't mean you become incapable of caring. It means your life is no longer waiting for someone else's decision to begin. You stop standing at the door wondering whether she's coming back. You start walking toward your own future. And maybe someday she recognizes what she lost. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe she reaches out. Maybe she never does. But here's the truth you need to carry with you. Her realization is not your responsibility. Her regret is not your reward. Her return is not your validation. Your growth is. Your peace is. Your self-respect is. So don't make your healing another strategy for getting someone back. Heal because you deserve to live without constantly negotiating for someone's attention. Build because your future deserves your focus. Love yourself enough to stop chasing what repeatedly makes you question your worth. And if someone from your past eventually comes back, let them meet the person you've become, not the person they could control with a little attention and a lot of uncertainty. Because the ultimate victory isn't making an avoidant woman realize she lost you. The ultimate victory is becoming so deeply rooted in yourself that whether she realizes it or not no longer determines how you live. You don't need her to regret losing you. You need to become someone you would never abandon again.